So last time what we did was we did crime data, right? So this class is all about data analysis. Lots and lots of different kinds of data out there. At first we did NFL data, and that was something real that we can all relate to. Obviously the Super Bowl just happened. You know, it's relevant information, it's real life. We were using that to make real life predictions. Our second project was taking crime data and looking to see what's going on in Montbello. And I asked you the question, was there any effect due to legalization of marijuana in January 2014? Whether that had any effect on the crime rate. So you guys used that, you used Excel to graph the data to kind of see what was going on. Again, this is real data. While we were doing it, we saw that there was a murder in Montbello as we were going through. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start the third section. We've been analyzing other people's data. Now what we're going to do is we're going to collect our own. Right? Does everybody remember, and I'll show a picture of this. Remember when we had the rock, we were running through asking everybody about the rock? We're going to do the same thing, except not with a rock. And I've learned from last year, it was a pain to carry that rock around. I think BJ pretty much was tipping it over all the time. He would get too excited. So what we're going to do is basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain what we're going to do, and I'm going to give you a little background into wisdom of crowds and why we would possibly want to do this. Okay, like I said, people have been using wisdom of crowds for a long time. And I'm going to give you the history on that. But obviously, we just used it to make our guesses on the Super Bowl. You know, obviously, we came up with Broncos scored 20, Carolina 26. Obviously, we didn't get the score right, but we were a lot more accurate when we take the wisdom of crowd than a lot of the individual guesses. Okay, and we're going to go over this. There's probably some mistakes why our numbers weren't as good as they could have been. Outliers?
Like Rocky's prediction?
Rod's prediction wasn't too bad, actually. Oh, Balboa's prediction, yeah, that is an outlier. Very good for saying outlier, by the way, Balboa. I'm impressed. So where does this all come from? And this comes from a guy named Sir Francis Galton. Have I talked about him before yet? I always say the same stories, and I always forget, what I'm doing. Balboa, put your computer down, please. You don't need your computer. There you go. All the way down. Put your screen down. Oh, just push it forward. That's fine. All right. Well, Sir Francis Galton and JC, you're going to enjoy this because you're going to get some history here. He was a mathematician, scientist, worked in fingerprinting. He did a lot of different stuff. In fact, he was so talented, they made him a Sir. You know, like Sir Elton John. You've heard of that?
Is it like Sherlock Holmes or something?
Yeah. Well, Sherlock Holmes wasn't a real character, but but he was pretty dang smart. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin. Has anybody heard of Charles Darwin?
Yeah.
Yes. From what?
From chemistry.
No, you're fired. Oh my.
Oh,
Staff, where have you heard of?
In biology.
Yeah. What concept?
Do we have to do something about
Survival
survival of the fittest?
of the fittest. Yes, evolution. Right. Charles Darwin was one of the first people to come up with the concept of evolution. So he was his cousin. Obviously, his cousin was more famous than he was. But I honestly think Francis Galton was even smarter. He was a tropical explorer. So basically, back in those days, here's what the scientists did. Is their big deal was to... obviously parts of the world weren't explored, so they'd go off and go to deepest, darkest Africa and discover all these plants and animals and then come back and go, look at me. And everyone would say, yay. Thanks for pushing back the savage nature of us. He was also a meteorologist. He came up with all kinds of different maps. He was very good at taking data and basically mapping it or graphing it so that people could understand. Psychologist and a criminologist. So with a criminologist, he basically kind of perfected how we can identify people with fingerprints. Okay? The reason why you probably haven't heard of him and why he's kind of been buried in history is that he was known as the father of eugenics. Does anybody know what eugenics is?
They drink?
Good guess. What? Anybody? So eugenics was a belief that certain people or even certain races were better than others. And that, yeah, boo, hiss. Yeah, that part, I think it was that part of what he did was garbage. But what's funny is what we're going to talk about, what we're going to use from him is the stuff that he did, the wisdom of crowds. And I think that actually kind of disproves eugenics, that the best people aren't the outliers. It isn't some race, it isn't some genotype or somebody with a certain DNA sequence. Probably the best humans are the average of all of us. Because when we ask a big group of people, the average is always better than each individual answer. He was also into geneticists. He was a geneticist. He kind of got this from his cousin, Charles Darwin. But he pioneered what's known as the biometric approach. And that's the belief that if you measure something, enough things about anything, you can figure it out. Kind of like we did with the crime, right? If you want to know what's going on in Montbello as far as crime goes, you have to look at the data. And we looked at a lot of data. And I would say we have a better idea of what's going on there than most people. And he was a statistician. We talked about variance, or standard deviation. Remember that concept? He was kind of the one that perfected that. He also developed this concept called correlation. So these are like R values. Or basically, as one thing goes up, does something else go up along with it? Or does it go actually in the opposite direction? Okay, and then what we're going to talk about is the wisdom of crowds. And I will explain how he came up with that. It's kind of a cool story. But he had some famous students. Here he is with this guy. His name was Carl Pearson. He came up with the Pearson correlation test. He loved his mentor so much that he wrote when Sir Francis Galton died, this Pearson character wrote a 3-volume biography on him. Yeah, I have not read that. But I've read his other stuff. He was a very interesting guy. And not all good stuff. So it was high school, so I can't talk about it, but you should read some of his stuff. I'm here to tell you that all these scientists, they're all people. All these famous people, even Charles Darwin, had his faults. Scientists are real individuals with real stories and real problems. And that just because they say something, come up with one thing that's smart doesn't mean the rest of their lives are smart. Trust me. I talk to scientists that I am amazed they can even tie their shoe. But here they are. They have $1 million grants doing research, right? Well, they influenced this guy. His name is, this is Spearman. Charles Spearman, he came up with another test. Instead of just taking the numbers, sometimes say you wanted to say, I want to correlate, I think somebody's height and their IQ is correlated. Like the taller somebody is, the higher their IQ, right? Those are two different scales. So what this guy did, Spearman, was basically rank all those, and then he'd do the correlations on the ranking. So you could basically test if two things were related that weren't necessarily the same thing. And I talked about Nate Silver, right? He was the guy who predicted the 2012 election. Again, he used this Sir Francis Galton's theories, this wisdom of crowd. Remember, he predicted the 2012 election. He didn't ask anybody who they were going to vote for. He basically took all the polls that were out there. Obviously, some leaned left, some leaned right. Took the actual middle of it and basically got the right predictions for the 2012 election. No, he wasn't lucky, man. This wisdom of crowd stuff works. And what I'm going to tell you is people, even in the CIA, are using it to figure out, like, say, what the Russians are doing. Are they called Russians anymore? Is it this? No, it's definitely not the Soviet Union anymore. So, yeah, the Russians. All right, well, here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about one of the last experiments that this guy did. And we are going to replicate this, so pay attention.